In this podcast or video, I will talk about a book on Saladin or Saladin, written by the French historian Anne-Marie Eddé. That book, like probably several that came out on the Crusades in general and the character of Saladin in particular over the past 10 or 15 years, tackles, of course, do tackle the man, do tackle the biography and the story of Saladin or Saladin in particular. It does look at the geopolitical scene of the Eastern Mediterranean or the Levant at the time, but it has, or it plays, or it pays a very specific attention to the cultural environment in which Saladin operated. The book, in terms of scope, spends, as you'd expect, some time, some pages, looking at the rise of Saladin. Where did he grow up? Where was he born, of course? The family to which he was born, which was a Kurdish family, in the service of a very prominent, probably by far the most prominent Turkish warlord, or a family of warlords that had established itself very much in western Iraq, eastern Syria at the time. And how did the family of Saladin came to prominence in the service of that Turkish family of warlords? How they have expanded their own territory, or a bit, shall we say, in the service of that Turkish family, how Saladin himself grew in that environment, how he moved to Syria and to Damascus in specific at a very early age, and grew and spent the formative years of his life there, and how a very special bond was developed between him and the city, which actually played a big role in his story and in his character, I would say. The book tells us about his rise politically and militarily in the service of that Turkish family of Nuruddin, basically, that specific, very successful and very prominent in Islamic history warlord in the 1100s. Of course, it does, Anne-Marie Eddé spends some time explaining to her reader the very complicated geopolitical scene of the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, which was beset by so many struggles between, of course, the Islamic forces of the time that were opposing the Crusaders, who had established their own kingdom in Jerusalem and several principalities primarily on the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant. But she also explains and goes into details of what was happening within the Islamic camp at the time, which was far from being unified. It was, in theory, under the sovereignty of the caliph, of the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, which is by far the most important caliphate in the history of Islamic civilization. And yet that was just in theory. It was a nominal sovereignty, because at the time the Eastern Mediterranean in general, and Egypt included to it, were very much fragmented between different powers. Some of those powers were Arabs, some of them were of Turkic origin, such as Nuruddin, for example. Some of them were Kurdish, such as the family of Saladin. But even within the Arab, or on the Arab side, there were very different influences. The caliph in Baghdad was surrounded by many Persians who have established or had established immense influence on the Abbasid caliphate at the time. The other caliphate in Cairo, in Egypt at the time, was the Fatimites, who were Shias and who came from Tunisia and from the Maghreb region in general. So what Anne-Marie Eddé is telling us here is how complicated the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, specifically Egypt, how that environment as a whole was very fraught and fluid and complicated and sometimes appears confusing to us, and why that background was very important and very relevant to the rise of Salah ad-Din. I think it's also very relevant to the readers today because that fragmentation and that fluidity is relatively similar in some ways to what has been happening in the Eastern Mediterranean in the last few years, in 2012, 13, 14, and up to today in 2019. So there's a bit of historical background that is very relevant and interesting and tells us a lot about how did Salah ad-Din came to create his own kingdom, how his rise to political power and prominence happened. But in reading about that, I think many readers will find many connotations to what has been happening also in the Eastern Mediterranean in the last 5 or 6 years, of ethnic differences, of sectarian differences, of political differences of different forces. Anne-Marie Eddé also shows us how Salah ad-Din came to become a very successful military leader. And I think she does it in a very unique way. Many historians wrote about Salah ad-Din by showing us his military genius in specific battles, specifically Hattin, and, well, specifically the entire campaign to capture Jerusalem, and focused on or delved too much on details. Anne-Marie Eddé gives us a good sense of his campaigns before the capture of, or the recapture of Jerusalem, in that specific battle and after that. But she also shows us when he failed, and he did fail several times actually militarily. But what she does, I think, in a brilliant way, is to show us how he thought about different military circumstances in the context of the politics of what he was going through, whether with the Crusaders, but also in the intra-politics of the Islamic world. His complicated relationship with the Caliph, or the Caliphate in Baghdad. His even complicated relationship with his own power base in Egypt, which he had conquered before, and he had ended effectively the Fatimide Caliphate in it. How there were some complications within not only his own camp, his own kingdom, but even his own family, and how all of that affected his military decision-making. She also delves a lot, actually, into the financials of the situation and how the resources that were at his command were sometimes massive, but sometimes quite meager, actually, and how the financial, managerial scene affected how he operated and how he fought his campaigns. Some people might say there's a bit of too much detail here. I think maybe some readers will find too much for them in that narrative. But for me, it was a very rich narrative because it makes us as readers see the decision maker here, Salah ad-Din, the decision maker, in a very realistic way. By seeing all of these factors, by showing us these details, actually in a very engaging way, by doing that, Anne-Marie Eddé makes us see Salah ad-Din as a human being, as a leader, as some sort of a prime minister, if you like, engaged in a war, as opposed to the hero that came to dominate the imagination of the East and the West, which I'll talk about in a moment. So her approach is very much focused on a realistic reading, somehow comprehensive and realistic presentation of the environment, of the circumstances in which Salah ad-Din or Saladin made his decisions. But then comes the most important aspect or feature of that book, which is the cultural side, which is exactly the point I highlighted before. How and why both the Islamic narrative and the Western Christian narrative, both of them were fascinated by Salah ad-Din, and both of them adopted him as a hero in very different contexts. Anne-Marie Eddé, I think, does a brilliant job in showing us the evolution of that process on both sides. She shows us why the Muslims, from very different backgrounds actually, from vastly different ideologies and very different perspectives, why they saw in Salah ad-Din a notion of the hero. And many people would say, oh, that's very simple. Of course, he captured or he retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders back to the Muslims in 1187. But that is actually when you read the story in detail and you see how the narrative on the Islamic side evolved, you would find that that is one factor among different factors that made many factions in the Islamic world, many narrators in the Islamic world, in the 13th century, 14th century, and going on, embrace the image of Salah ad-Din and develop it in their own ways, in their own different ways, and evolve that image into the notion of the ultimate hero in the Islamic story, probably since the end of the age of the immediate successors of the Prophet Muhammad. She spends a lot of time telling us why, or showing us the different views on why that happened on the Islamic side. And then she also spends some time showing us how, by looking at very different sources, very different narratives, and often comparing the different narratives, and show us that actually many times these narratives disagreed with themselves a lot. But that's not important, because the point for each one of them was to portray, for his own reasons, why Salah ad-Din is a hero by my own standards, which is very different from the standards of the other, even if both of them belong to the same overarching Islamic camp. She does the same thing on the Western side. And the story on the Western side is arguably more interesting, actually, because Salah ad-Din, immediately after the Third Crusade in specific, actually, immediately after his success of retaking, of the conquest of Jerusalem, he was presented very much as the enemy. He was very much demonized in the Western narrative. But we see the evolution of that. We see a massive, vastly surprising evolution of that idea of Salah ad-Din, the representative of the enemy, the representative of the demonized Muslim in the Western imagination, to some sort of an opponent worthy of respect. We see that specifically in the late 13th and 14th century, and then we see a massive evolution towards embracing Salah ad-Din, towards reimagining Salah ad-Din as the hero of the other, as representing everything that's wonderful and inspiring in the Orient, in the East, in the Islamic world. And we do see, for example, on one example, we do see that Dante, for just to give a specific case, included Salah ad-Din as one of only 3 Muslims who Dante spared to throw into his own hell in the Divine Comedy. The other 2 were Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina. And Dante confined the 3 to some sort of a fortress, somehow spared from the worst of the hell that he created in the Divine Comedy. But we do see later on the evolution again of the idea, the notion of what Salah ad-Din represented in the Western imagination, growing from just that enemy that is that is a bit noble, to an admired character. We see that in the writings of Voltaire, actually, to very much later on Saladin coming to represent solidly in his own character as a very distinct case all what the West imagined or took in its own mind to represent all that is great and wonderful about the East, and specifically about the Islamic world. That evolution of the image of Saladin, of the positioning of Saladin in the Western imagination, is a significant part of the story that Anne-Marie Eddé tells us. And of course, the how here is also very different from the how the Islamic civilization embodied in Saladin the notion of the hero. So we do see a very different evolutions, both reaching the same conclusion. On the Islamic side and on the Western side, we do see the taking of the character of Saladin and the story of Saladin, and actually distorting the story massively, distorting the reality massively, changing the facts almost entirely on both sides to create an image that at the end is the same. Saladin, a hero, a very noble character, the ultimate embodiment of the Eastern Islamic ruler, warrior, conqueror, who is just, who is generous, who is dignified. But the reasons each of the two sides did that, and how each of the two sides did that, could not be more different. And the two stories could not be more different. And sometimes the stories on each side are very entertaining, actually. And I think one of the wonderful things about that book is how Anne-Marie Eddé tells us the why and the how on both sides. There are two final things which I think are also great positives about this book. One is the research. Many books that were written on the Crusades delved a lot in the English and the French sources, especially from the 13th, 14th century onwards. And some books, at least ones I am familiar with, in England used a lot the English and French sources, of course, but also the Arabic sources, and specifically the ones that were stored in Egypt. And many of the most notable scholars of the time spent time in Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s in specific, in books that became major sources were published and became major sources in the 70s, 80s, and maybe early 90s. Anne-Marie Eddé, of course, does that, but she has something which I think is rarely seen in many other books, which is a very in-depth usage of Syrian sources and some Lebanese sources. The Levantine sources were not as easily available as the Egyptian sources in the 1960s and 1970s, and Anne-Marie Eddé manages to delve a lot into those sources. She also takes us in a tour, a short tour actually towards the end of the book, but a very interesting tour of how the Arab nationalist movement from the late 19th century, and specifically in the first half of the 20th century, also adopted Saladin and used his story with huge changes and alterations to the character of the man himself to inflate the personalities, the positionings of the strong men of the Arab world of the 1960s and 1970s, and to somehow present them to their own people as modern-day versions of Saladin. And of course, to do that, there was a need to adopt Saladin and make him a tool in the propaganda used at that time. And Anne-Marie Eddé does that in an interesting way, actually, by drawing our attention to a number of books and movies and plays that were tools in doing that. The other thing or the final point, which I think also makes this book really wonderful, is that to a very large extent, Anne-Marie Eddé leaves the reader to decide in many aspects. There were times where she almost dismissed a certain interpretation of why something took place, or why a specific part of the story happened in a certain way, or why a certain historian, for example, in the Arab world in the 16th century, wrote something or interpreted something in a certain way. But it's rare when she does that. Largely, she presents to us the facts, she presents to us the different narratives, she presents to us, as I said, the two stories of how, and more importantly, why both sides, on the Islamic side and on the Christian, or later on the Western side, adopted Saladin and portrayed him in a certain way. But she presents different interpretations based on different sources without usually or typically throughout the book lending a decisive view. And I think this is excellent because she leaves the reader to decide. She creates a bond between the facts on the pages, between the different narratives presented on the pages, and the mind of the reader, who in this case becomes, I think, some sort of an analyst of these different narratives and engages with the story, especially that the story here is not just about the life of Saladin, not just about the wars of Saladin, and certainly not just about the geopolitical scene of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt at the time. It's rather that evolution of the idea of Saladin in the Eastern world, in the Islamic world, and in the Western world, in the Christian world. And by leaving the interpretations open for the reader to decide why certain thing happened, why that specific view took hold and became dominant, say, in the 18th century, as opposed to that different interpretation, that Anne-Marie Eddé leaves open to the reader. And I think this enriches the book to a large extent. Overall, it is a wonderful book and a very engaging read for anyone interested, whether in the character of Saladin and what it came to mean in the different imaginations of the two cultures, but also, I think, in how history is not just written, but how history is perceived in a cultural setting. This is a very good case study for that.